Did you know that the conquest of Siberia was one of the most brutal and fastest expansions of the Russian Empire in history? A place where everything began with a daring adventurer and a group of Cossacks. In the 1580s, a man named Yermak Timofeyevich, a Cossack commander, set out with his men toward the unknown lands of the East. Behind him were wealthy merchants known as the Stroganovs, who were seeking access to the endless resources of Siberian furs. Furs that were valued like gold in the markets of Europe. Yermak, after crossing rivers and unknown forests, reached the territory of the Siberian Khanate, a local state ruled by Khan Kuchum. Fierce battles took place between the Cossacks and the Khan's forces. In the end, Yermak managed to defeat the Khanate and practically opened the gates of Siberia to the Russian Empire. This victory was the starting point of a wave that, in less than a century, carried the Russians from the Ural Mountains to the shores of the Pacific Ocean, the beginning of a path marked by blood, greed, and the ambition of imperial expansion. Thank you for staying with us in this part of history. If you found this story interesting, please subscribe to our channel and like the video so we can prepare more stories from the history of the world for you. When Yermak and the Cossacks opened the gates of Siberia, the real story had just begun. The Russians, determined not to lose this vast land, quickly set out to establish a stable governing structure. One of the first things they did was build ostrogs, wooden fortresses along important rivers. It may sound surprising, but these simple forts soon became the nuclei of today's major Siberian cities. For example, the city of Tobolsk, which served as the capital of Siberia for a long time, grew out of one of these ostrogs. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the story was something called yasak. This was a strange tax imposed on the native peoples, not in money, but in furs. Every native man had to deliver a fixed number of valuable pelts each year, such as the highly prized Siberian sable. Interestingly, these furs were so valuable in Europe at the time that some referred to them as soft gold. To collect yasak, the Russians sometimes stormed native villages with force and violence. If someone couldn't pay, they were forced into hard labor or even had their families taken as hostages. This weakened many indigenous tribes and made them heavily dependent on the empire. During this same period, waves of Russian settlers began moving into Siberia. Hunters, traders, and even exiled criminals. In a way, Siberia turned into a wild frontier, full of both opportunities and dangers. Thus, the Russian Empire had not only conquered Siberia, but also solidified its control over this vast land through fur taxation, the building of forts, and the resettlement of its own people. After consolidating their power in the heart of Siberia, the Russians did not remain still. For them, Siberia was not just a new land, but a bridge toward the unknown East. Every river flowing toward the rising sun was like a natural road. They launched their boats on the Ob, the Yenisei, and later the Amur, advancing step by step. Imagine small groups of Cossacks and adventurers with tens of kilometers of snow and forest before them. There were no roads, no cities, only endless wild nature. Yet they moved like a calm, steady wave, building ostrogs and small outposts, and planting the Tsar's flag in the most remote places. One of the most astonishing stories was the Russians' arrival at the shores of the Pacific Ocean. In 1639, a small band of Cossacks, after crossing mountains and rivers, finally reached the Sea of Okhotsk. They were the first Europeans to set foot in this corner of East Asia. To imagine it, you need only know that before this, European maps showed only unknown lands there. But now, the Russians had reached the edge of the world. The advance to the east, however, was not always peaceful. Along the way, they clashed with powerful native tribes such as the Yakuts and the Chukchi. Bloody wars broke out, some of which lasted for years. Even in the 17th century, the Chinese Empire, the Qing dynasty, entered the scene and stopped the Russians at the Amur River. The outcome of this confrontation was the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689, the first official agreement between Russia and China, which defined the borders of the two empires in the east. Thus, in less than a century, Russia not only dominated the heart of Siberia, but also pushed its borders to the shores of the Pacific Ocean, the place where the sun rises, and where, for Europeans, the known world once ended. When the Russian Empire finally pushed its borders to the Pacific Ocean, Siberia was no longer just an unknown land. It had become a pillar of Russia's power. Yet this vast expansion came with heavy consequences. For the indigenous peoples of Siberia, the arrival of the Russians was a historical tragedy. Many smaller tribes were wiped out by wars, unfamiliar diseases, and crushing taxation. Some of them, like the Chukchi people, resisted for decades and bravely stood against the Tsars' armies. But in the end, many were forced to surrender. On the other hand, by conquering Siberia, Russia gained access to an endless source of wealth. The fur trade, gold and silver mines, and later, vast reserves of coal and oil turned this frozen land into a vital treasury for the empire. Without Siberia, Russia would never have risen to become one of the world's great powers. The new borders also had deep historical significance. Treaties in the 17th and 18th centuries with China and later with Japan reshaped the map of East Asia. Siberia tied Russia not only to Europe but also to Asia, forging the country's unique dual identity, both European and Asian. And the legacy of this conquest, today, if you look at a map, you see that Russia is the largest country in the world. That vastness is a direct result of the brutal conquest and relentless expansion into Siberia. Though the voices of ancient tribes have faded into the silence of forests and snow, their struggles and suffering remain an unforgettable part of world history. That is why the conquest of Siberia is not just a story of expanding borders. It is a story of greed, survival, resistance, and the transformation of an entire continent. Thank you for watching this journey through history. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our channel and stay tuned for more fascinating tales from the past.